This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In today's episode, we discuss contextual lore, inferential world building, and creating a safe space at your table. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop scenarios across the board, how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And I'm exhausted. So we're going to kick things off with probably pretty big shower thought. Take it away, Ian.
So for the last few weeks, I have been thinking about world building again. And it's not just regular old world building, like not just like what are the countries, what are the towns, who lives there? Are there humans, dwarves, gnomes, that kind of thing. And I have been thinking about, instead of like just creating the world, how to more immerse players within that world because they live in it. The characters live there. They were born there. They grew up there. Even if they came from another continent or whatever, they still were born here. And so I think that it's very important to respect that and amplify that experience by creating what I call inferential world building. So part of this is that characters have a predefined knowledge of the world. There is definitely some stuff that you can just kind of lore drop, be like, this is where you live, this is the city, this city is known for exporting such and such and importing such and such, these things. But then there are other things when they're exploring outside the place that they are used to, that I don't want to just do these massive lore drops anymore. Like these big chunks of text that exposit things about the world. I feel they are ineffective and non-immersive. So good examples of these are in modules where they have these boxed texts that basically set up the world for characters and stuff. And sometimes those can be effective, but other times it's just like you're putting knowledge in the player's hands without allowing them to draw their own conclusions about what that knowledge actually means about the world around them. Whether or not the conclusions are correct is a whole other thing that you can, exposit for them later or reveal to them later that, hey, this is the conclusion you drew, but in fact, it's actually this. And one way to think about that is actually that you're kind of setting up a mystery for them, an explorative mystery, where you're leaving hints and clues about what's been going on in this place and why. And so an example of this that I would pull from my own games is that in Curse of Strahd, there are two deities that are kind of introduced in the module, Mother Night and the Morning Lord. Now, without giving away too much, the Morning Lord is kind of like the absent god of this world, the absent god with a capital G. And Mother Night is a very present god in my world, but she's considered evil. Nobody likes her. And so something that I've done to try and show the power, the presence that these gods have in Strahd is these statues that just, these ruined statues that just line the roads of Old Svalage Road. And they are very old, clearly, and decrepit. They're crumbling. Some of them have been outright destroyed. And it's up to the players initially to figure out who this might be. So they could, pick up the pieces of the statue and like try to put it together and see like what it depicts. They'll find out that it's like a lady, feminine form or something like that. But they might not know too much until they start asking the townsfolk. So that's kind of like how they're exploring the world with their own agency to draw their own conclusions about the world. Now, I've noticed that in highly successful games like Elder Scrolls or even roguelikes like Barony, there's a lot more to be inferred from primary sources as well. Everybody knows that the Elder Scrolls have like loads of books. I think there's actually like 580 books in Skyrim alone. um, and that's a lot that's a lot of literature, you know, like nobody's going to read all that, but when you do read it, usually it's a primary source or a historical account that helps you learn more about how the world was made or prominent figures within that world and their perspectives. And by doing that, you can infer what might have been going on during the writing of that book. And I think that's really interesting. Now, in in D&D, that would be considered a lore drop because it's massive text and you're just reading the text to the players basically. But at the same time, I think there's a lesson to be learned about how we can create a scenario where the players can learn for themselves what has happened in the world. Like, oh, there's some ruins over there. Let's go check them out. Oh, it's brick and mortar buildings, like as if it was a city, from a city sometime. But now there's just like this little hamlet. Well, what does that mean? What happened? You know? And that prompts players to become more immersed in their character's experience, because it's like, well, now it's not just being handed to me on a silver platter, you know? Now it's not like now it's not that I just go to the DM and say, hey, what's going on here? Like, what would my character know? And it's like, well, as the DM, I'm not going to tell you. And the reason is that your character doesn't know this particular thing. Instead of asking, what would your character know, I guess, you ask, what doesn't my character know about this place? And what can I do about that? And that's something that I'm really interested in doing. Another game that does this is Breath of the Wild, Legend of Zelda's Breath of the Wild, where Hyrule is in ruins, basically, in shambles. And there's all these remnants of a war that happened. And there's these small goddess statues that you can find like in random places. And they are generally not all the same. Like, they're all the same goddess statue, but they have contextual clues around them that give you hints as to what may have happened before you got there. And that is something that I think they do really well, because for the inquisitive mind, now this is actually something I should mention. This is a play style choice. So like, if your players aren't interested in that kind of thing, then it's like, well, you know, you tried. But for me, this is something that really speaks to me, because I have been lately playing inquisitive characters. I've been playing a Feywild ranger who is very much like a detective for the Feywild almost. I've been playing a Way of Mercy monk that is like a physician. So they have a very analytical mind. They are hungry for knowledge because knowledge allows them to act in the world. And so I've been just thinking, how do we do that? How do we give players who want that experience without just saying, roll an intelligence check, roll a history check, you know, that kind of thing. That's what I want to avoid. I want to create an environment that has enough detail to proc questions and allow players to draw conclusions without oversaturating it and giving them too much to work with. That's another thing, is trying to balance that out. Because I've been part of some games, and I've heard some anecdotal evidence that when players have too much on their plate, when they have too many plot hooks, too many possibilities, it's just like, well, I can't work with it. Like, there's just too much. And what if I do it wrong? That's another thing, like Tomb of Annihilation or something like that. If you get the puzzle wrong, you die. So it's how do you deal with that? So that's pretty much the start of what my thoughts are on inferential world building. I have ideas about how we can go about this, but I wanted to present those thoughts to you guys first.
Just real quick before I turn this over to Adam, you said something really interesting, which I think for DMs and players alike, this is something really powerful to acknowledge, which is, at its heart, D&D and any role-playing game I've ever been a part of is ultimately a mystery game. And what I'm speaking to here is mystery in terms of the abstract, not in terms of the trope. So, like, not every TTRPG is like a murder mystery where you're trying to figure out who done it. But if you think of mystery as a puzzle where you are presented with incomplete information, and your goal is to fill in the blanks until you can infer or deduce an outcome, that you discover along the way. That's TTRPGs. I mean, even that's the relationship between a dungeon master and a player. The dungeon master knows things, and depending on the player questions, they give them answers, So it's like, what's the walls like? What does the floor feel like? What's the sensory input? If the DM doesn't give the players certain information, the players can't act on it, So, and ultimately, you're also right, Ian, if there's too much, I've been that player. There's so much going on. There's so many possibilities. Where do we even start, But, I mean, even if you think about combat, when you guys are as players and you start in combat, like, it's you don't know the monster's armor class, you don't know its features, you don't know its to hit. You discover all of those things over time, You go to hit it, and it's like an 18 hits. That was a previously unknown piece of information that we've now discovered through play. So, and ultimately every TTRPG is that discovery through play, right? And ultimately that's what a mystery ends up being. So really what we're talking about isn't, is it a mystery or not? We're talking about the kind of some of the techniques and mindsets that produce a certain feeling in your players as they pursue a mystery, So like, it's what are the methods that your players can rely on when you adjudicate a game that they will be able to get information that may be reliable or unreliable. So, like, one of the techniques, you already mentioned it, ask NPCs, like set up NPCs. And we've talked about this in our latest few episodes. The NPCs may have folklore about the monsters that may be more or less accurate. It may be exaggerated, but there's a kernel of truth, Or maybe it's that you present this ahead of time. This is one of the things that drives me bonkers with DMs, is when DMs either try to copy and paste their definition of skills using the book instead of the practical applications in play. So it's like, insight checks read body language. They don't say you use an insight check in order to figure out if someone is lying or not, or you use a perception check to try to perceive your environment. This is the classic why I hate investigation and perception as two separate skills, because to me, investigation shouldn't be, I'm finding something specific. If I'm looking for the cup in the room, I'm not going to be like, well, was I educated enough to understand what a cup is? And if you're perceptive, you're not going to sit there and be like, oh, I can see everything, but not specific things. Like, that dynamic just doesn't make sense from a gameplay perspective. It doesn't add a deeper narrative. This is going off the rails. I'm going to turn it over to Adam, but that's basically, as a DM, train your players to build their characters with specific skills so that they can gather information.
As a quick aside into that investigation perception argument, I'm sure there's a more elegant solution, but as I ruminate on it, I'm finding that I'm using investigation and perception often as a, hey, give me a perception check or an investigation check, whichever you prefer. And at least I'm giving it to the option of the player, but the more elegant solution is, why have it tied to two different attributes that have two different modifiers, and maybe one of them has a negative for a player, and why not just have it be one thing so that you can get both benefits? Because investigation, especially in many of the Cloak and Dagger worlds, trying to put it all, you need investigation just as much as you need perception. But then I like use investigation to kind of put things together, and then perception to see stuff. And investigation tends to be more like not problem solving, but like putting together the clues. you saw these things. Now, what does it mean? And that's investigation. And then perception is, you saw all these things. Now, what does that mean? And that's why you need the intelligence part. But if you don't frame it that way, then it gets kind of confusing, and they don't work either way.
Well, and what I'm saying is, like, even the book says
yeah.
investigation, perception is general, and I like
That's
what
not correct. Yeah.
but it's what the Dungeon Master's Guide says.
I know.
So it's funny because, like, I agree with you, Adam. Like, perception to me means sensory input. What can you actually see? Investigation is your character's deductive ability, and now this calls into play a key conflict built into the game's design, which is if you perceive certain things and you as a player put it together, but your character has a -1 intelligence, would your character put it together? On the other hand, like, what happens if you as the player are just tired that night, but your character would be able, that's where passive investigation can come into play, where it's like, all right, I understand that you, Ian, you're like really tired after like a night shift at work. By the way, your character's passive investigation is a 17. So I'm gonna whisper you and send a note across the table that your character put this together. And maybe that'll help, you know?
Oh yeah. Now, what this starts to bring into play of what I started writing down is, I think that there are 3 types of knowledge in the game world. And there's base knowledge that most people would know. There's personal knowledge that individual characters know based upon their life experiences or their jobs or like their class, whatever their training is. And then there's discovered knowledge that we discover throughout the course of the game. Now, discovered knowledge can also fall into the category of, combat knowledge of what is this creature's abilities and whatnot. But I say base, but really it's general. It's everybody knows this. And then when it comes to general knowledge, having a living document has been so helpful for all of the new campaigns that I'm now starting. It's wonderful because then all the players that have access to one right now, that's it's mostly finished, even as it's evolving, have said, it's so good for me to just go, oh yeah, who's that? And then go back to the document. They like have it open right next to them, and they'll be taking their own notes and whatnot. But and writing and getting their notes is their own preferences. But to have general knowledge grounds the world and gives them launching points to be able to say, oh, the relationship between angels and devils is important in this setting. This is what I know about it. So the fact there's an angel here right now is a big freaking deal. Or this is completely normal and I shouldn't freak out. But then to have personal knowledge, to have I have personalized documents for all of my players now, at least for Gray Owls, and then I'll have them for Dark Owls soon. And that's been super helpful because now they're specialists in those areas. And then if it's new-ish to them, or it's a detail that wasn't quite present, or maybe they're missing it, I can whisper that to them. And then what I'm finding that a lot of my, especially the teenage players, are here for is the discovered knowledge, because it takes the holes in their specific and their personal knowledge and the general knowledge. It takes the holes and fills them in. And anytime I do a lore drop, someone sent me a picture of like their character superimposed in front of a giant board of sticky notes and like red lines across them, just going, oh, it all makes sense now. And they're here for that. They're here for that, the discovery of what's going on, or what was the hidden knowledge that now fills in that missing piece that they've been looking for this whole time. Or maybe not even looking for, just I didn't know it was there, and now I see it. And all of that being said, that is a lot of planning. It's a lot of planning. It's a lot of having things ready to go. And then there's a lot of things in there that can be unplanned that you sort of make up together, you cooperatively create. But then that does need to be documented somewhere so that if it comes back later, we don't lose it. And I can see where this is Based on the amount of world building that I do on a daily basis, I think that having these three knowledges is extremely important for my own comfort level, because it grounds the world and I think helps give my players agency that they can act on and discover things from a place of strength. And what this also boils into is I think we mentioned it a podcast or two ago of, talk like you live here. If characters talk like they live here, then they have working knowledge. They might have slang, they might have but it isn't just, I am the hero and I walk into this town that I've lived in for 30 years, but I have no idea how it works. It's a lot better. How's it going, Hotman? Hey, Hotman, 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 Hotman. We're not, it's, whereas you would know, oh, David Crosswind is the local tailor. Ames is the smith. You grew up with him. He's been there since you were born. And if the player already knows that going in, how does that then change their interactions? Instead of going, hello, Mr. Blacksmith, how are you today? Oh, hey, Johnny, how's mom? Instead, it's, hey, Ames, I need some leather boots. Oh, yeah, sure, man, you'll get, yeah, I know it's for you, buddy. It's 10 gold off, because there's a relationship there, there's established rapport, and of course, this is an of course they would know them, of course they would understand them. There's a lot of then implied and inferential knowledge from that allows a more immersive experience. Instead of, I am NPC man, yes, this is my hometown, but I don't know anyone in it. Who's that guy? Who is that guy? Do I know them? And instead of asking those questions, the player already knows them, or already has a reference to fall back on that says, I do know this. Then the things they don't know become more significant. And I think that's the powerful part there. Why so many of my players just thrive on that discoverable knowledge is because it's more valuable. Instead of just, I need to discover everything because I don't understand anything, it becomes, I understand quite a bit, but I'm missing these key points and I need to figure them out because they have value. It changes the value structure a lot more. It's more work, I think, for the DM. And if you're a pants DM, this might be hard, or might require a bit of bookkeeping on the fly. But I do think it simplifies things at the onset and it's going to increase your immersion tremendously for yourself and for your players, because you'll have all a working knowledge of, this is what this setting is, this is what has happened in it, this is the history. And if they don't know, if I've got an amnesiac character, that's fine. Now they're discovering quite a lot. But maybe their personal knowledge is the binding thread, because they only remember like the last 3 days and they remember them pristinely. And then how engaging is that if they've chosen that path to then discover this world again and try to form new conclusions instead of just the old hat model.
Before I turn it over to Ian, just to wrap up that thought a little bit too, that's very powerful, understanding the knowledge that your characters value, because that means when you build the world, you can build it around your players' preferred knowledge. So like you were mentioning it, that's a brilliant distinction between, general knowledge, personal knowledge, and discovered knowledge. And as soon as you said it, I realized that the reason that Solomon, who's like my Witcher build, is my favorite character is because the amount of personal knowledge he has, right? He's got a plus 14 to Arcana. He's got a plus 14 to nature. So he's got a plus 17 to perception. Like nothing gets by him. So, like the immersive, like what you were talking about, Adam, with like knowing the blacksmith and knowing them personally, that is immersive knowledge. That's personal knowledge. And you need to set that up ahead of time for players to leverage. But if your Shadowfell crew likes discovered knowledge more, which Ian also said, It might not be amnesiac. It might just be that they're in a land they're not familiar with. So it could be that I was born on the Western continent, but now I'm on the Eastern continent. Like, or like Curse of Strahd. I almost prefer the stuck in a portal method of like, there's some weird thing happening in this place in the world that I'm used to. We go to investigate. The weird things happening are a result of a planar rift with this demi-plane. And now we're stuck here and we have to get home. But because we're stuck here, the rules don't work like we're used to. So now all of it is discovered knowledge because you're constantly discovering what's happening with the world. Now the players don't have to do a lot of prep work themselves to understand how this new world works, you know? So actually for that campaign in particular, I prefer the portal opens up and we get sucked in method over it's a natural part of the world, because now the DM part of horror is knowing that you can't know it. You know, it's once you know what the rules are, it's no longer horror because it's not scary. The fear is in the unknown. But anyway, I'm going to kick it over to Ian.
Yeah, I have a couple of things there. One of them is just based off what you just said, which is that this isn't like a natural part of the world, but it's like a both and scenario, because in my homebrew world, this place has been covered in mists in the modern era. It's been covered in mist for like 3,000 years now. And it's like, nobody goes there because nobody returns from there. So why would you go there? It's dangerous. And, you know, that can be enticing to some adventurers, like people who are like, it's like the Bermuda Triangle. It's just compasses and stuff. Nobody knows where they are, so they can't get back. It's not anything weird. It's just mist. And it's like, we can't see anything. But then there's also something to consider, that if it is like the mythological Bermuda Triangle, where you literally can't get back because you go into another dimension or whatever, how do I get players to go there? Like, nobody's going to want to go there because they love this place. They were born here. And yeah, sure, like maybe they don't stay in their hometown the whole time, but they don't want to like disappear from the world to like forever, especially for something that's unknown, which is something that we talked about at length before this podcast started, which is that fear of change, that fear of the unknown. And I think it's interesting because what I did to get you guys into that realm was basically I had the campaign start right like a few years after the mist appeared, not thousands of years when everybody's already learned their lesson not to go there. And of course, you know, there's also multiple timelines to consider. You know, if somebody goes in the mist and they finish the module Curse of Strahd, depending on the ending, is the mist still there 1,000 years or something like that? And I think that just depends on the party and the campaign that you're trying to run at the time, and whether or not the party wants to go and investigate that place. So, and the other thing was something that Adam said. The other thing was, you mentioned, John, that Solomon prefers personal knowledge because he has all this knowledge to draw upon that allows him to act upon the world. And to contrast with that, Rowan prefers discovered knowledge because she is displaced. She, like, even though Solomon has experiences to rely on that are relatively, you know, relatively closer to what point in time we're at right now, Rowan was displaced in a manner where she doesn't have a lot of personal knowledge to rely upon in that sense. And so she has to rely on the discovered knowledge and draw conclusions and such. Like, for example, with there was a scenario that we discovered an artifact of Lolth, and Rowan is like, she was a little power hungry, but not like because she's greedy. It's like, I need this. I might need this to fulfill my goals, to get back home, to back to when I was. And I think that implies that there is a gap in her discovered knowledge that she's trying to fill, and it shows how open she is to learning new things, really, I would say. And then there was another thing. It's been a few minutes ago. Trying to
Sorry.
remember it.
Well, as you're thinking about it,
Yeah.
to go off that comment you made about Rowan, when you say that, what it does is, maybe I should revise this a little. I'm going to conflict with something I just said. One of the things I built Solomon very intentionally for him to be able to gather information, whether it's sensory input through perception or whether it's deduction through investigation. He's got like skills in pretty much all of like the intelligence, relevant wisdom categories, you know, and he's terrible at charisma. But like one of the things he does, because he is actually in a similar narrative place as Rowan is. Like his backstory for Grey Owls, which is in the 6th age, is that he was a character from the 5th age that basically woke up in the 6th age. And he's like, well, this is different. So a lot of the joy of playing him is the interaction between personal and discovered knowledge of, when I left, this is what was the norm. How does that interact with what's the norm now? Or I fought monsters like this before. This is how these monsters act and what their anatomy is. And then throughout like a fight, like say with the Remorazes, it's like, oh, there is a difference. And what could that mean? You know? So there is a large component of the discovered knowledge, but it's in reference to the personal knowledge as opposed to being completely amnesiac and not knowing anything that's going on, you know, and having that pure discovered knowledge. So, yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing. Before I turn it back to you, one other thing that Pat in the chat, I'm gonna give him a shout out here as one of our patrons. He mentioned that you should go to DM Shower or patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. But anyway, one of the things that he said was that he's played characters that might have a high perception, but if he knows that they're low investigation, even if he as the player figured out what to do with like something that he perceived, like what he'll do is like take another player whose character concept is someone investigative or intelligent, and like in character go up to them and be like, I found this thing. What's this thing? To give them the chance to shine as a character, because that's the character they built. And to me, that's why the more I play, the more I don't like the whole our character builds are secret kind of thing. Because now you can't establish that team dynamic and trust with your fellow players in that same way. Like, you know, I'm playing a game right now with Ian where Ian's playing a wizard and I'm playing a barbarian. And he's not a dumb barbarian, but he knows that Ian's character is a wizard. So I'm just like, if we discover something, even as a player, if I'm like, oh, those are boots of striding, I'm going to be like, Ian's wizard character, what are these boots? And even if Ian doesn't know, the DM will now be able to be like, Ian, your character knows this, and Ian will be able to role play that reveal. So that's how you can kind of separate the player and the character knowledge, is by relying on your teammates who have been clear and upfront. This is the character concept and feel that I'm going for, and allow them to embody that, especially if it's something they're uncomfortable with, because that will now give them the confidence that they can RP that character effectively.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I do think we've mentioned that before as well, that when it comes to this conflict of like, what does your player know, what does your character know, would you, just because you're playing the barbarian, does that mean that you as a player cannot allow yourself to be investigative, to be inquisitive and things like that? And I think that's a good way to say it, is you know, building team dynamic, building teamwork by integrating everybody's skills together. If one person doesn't know, maybe somebody else in the party knows, that kind of thing. And I really enjoy that. There was let's see here. I think I remember, I don't think it's that's relevant anymore, but I think I remember what I was thinking about when Adam was talking, which was talking about those relationships that you have with the people around you from the place you live in. And part of that reminded me actually of anime, which is, generally speaking, anime is like a passive experience. We are onlookers. We are always looking to see what the characters are going to do in the scenarios that they're put in and things like that. We have no control over the story or anything. And and that doesn't mean that it can't be related to D&D as well, because if you have, if you're witnessing other players, other characters interact with the world around you, like, yeah, you could go up and talk to them or whatever, but like by using the experience that you have of just watching how they talk to people, you can infer a lot of things about the world. And in anime, I'm thinking specifically actually of animes like, and you know, you could choose other anime, but for some reason in my mind, Goblin Slayer came up and ReZero. Goblin Slayer, there's a character who is very knowledgeable about the world and has built, you know, relationships with people, but doesn't get too close. And you can tell based on the way that they interact with other people, based on the way that they try to get help or always go it alone and things like that. Ignoring other elements of the anime. And in ReZero, the guy, this is the whole premise of the anime, so it's not spoilers. The guy dies like every day, and he has to try and figure out these social interactions and navigate them like a puzzle, because, you know, he dies is because something went terribly, terribly wrong. And so that's actually something pretty cool, actually, I think we could learn from anime there, from ReZero, and put in our games, is kind of treating it like the respawn mechanic. What happens if you're in a dungeon and you can't die? What if like you take Tomb of Annihilation and somebody's like put a curse over the entrance of the portal that doesn't allow you to die before completing the dungeon, and you have to start over every time? Now, when I say start over, I don't mean like you don't know anything about the stuff. You don't lose any knowledge. It's kind of like doing a speed run. Like eventually you're going to hit a speed bump and it's all going to go, you know, it's all going to break apart. You're going to have to start over. But you learn things along the way that you can do to help yourself gain momentum and eventually break through that barrier that is lying ahead of you. Even in games like Undertale, that happens because there's a reset mechanic. You can just reset and be like, okay, I'm not going to go that way this time. I'm going to go this way and find out what's over there. And maybe that way's better, maybe it's not, but I don't know yet, and I'm going to find out. And won't that be exciting?
It's like the Super Meat Boy mechanic.
Yeah, exactly. And now, you know, D&D is a very different game. It's an RPG. There is social interaction. There's exploration. It's not all about puzzle solving and combat, although I guess you could make the argument that everything is puzzle solving. But this doesn't mean that there isn't something to learn from other media, other video games, RPGs, roguelikes especially. That's actually something I've been doing over on Twitch. If you guys want to check that out, I have a schedule that I've just been like doing this, what I call the level up project, just to hint at it, where I just explore these other RPGs and other video games, and I'm just like, how can I take this and put it in D&D and make it enhance the experience, not just copying it, but taking the elements that really would make it better, which is why I look at things like Skyrim and stuff. So yeah, that's really awesome, I think, is when you get that stuff and you can be like using it for inspiration.
In recent times, I have become much more entertained, immersed, and energized by a branch of college humor called Dimension 20. Now, normally I'd be the guy over here that's like, I like Critical Role, and Critical Role is great. But I really think for all the attention that Matt Mercer gets, people really need to pay attention to the DM, Brennan Lee Mulligan. And I'm finding that his tables that he runs are full of fun as well as insanely immersive and powerful emotional moments with really organic storytelling. And you can really tell that they're having a lot of fun. He's really upfront about like, yeah, let's just homebrew that. Let's just do that right now. And it feels a lot more like a fun table. It isn't so much we're telling a story like a podcast show, like this deep emotional thing. And by not doing that, there's always a comedy spin with this. Oddly enough, the comedy is there, but there's also some intense role playing. And in a way, by making it sort of comedic and lighter, it opens the door for those deeper experiences to be stronger. I say all of that to say, go watch Dimension 20. Go watch Fantasy High. Go find The Unsleeping City. It's just amazing, amazing stuff. Escape from Bloodkeep is awesome. And all of that is Brendan Lee Mulligan just rocking out. With players that are cast members, yes, they are creating a show, and yet their relationships to the world are immediately established. Now they have to be because they're running a show, but also to watch them improvise on the spot. These people are still actors. They're members of College Humor and all that. And yet you can see them become human beings. They're clearly people that are playing this game and are going, wait, what? When something gets revealed to them. And it's a very organic experience. So you feel like you're along for the ride. And yet, the first episode of The Unsleeping City and the first episode of Fantasy High are great examples of having each of your players have a full working knowledge of what they know and how their interactions work, what relationships they already have, so that they can react and interact believably and organically without having to pause and go, wait, who is this woman? Oh, that's your mother. Oh, I react this way. It's just this person shows up. Oh, hey, Dad. And it's great. And it's something that we often forget right at the get-go of a campaign. Now, again, it's a show. So, of course, they pre-establish these things. But how cool is it if you, at even your casual table, can have those pre-established relationships already there in the background? The player already has them. They already would understand. And they can now think about, instead of, who is this person? Is that my mom? Instead, the questions they're asking are, how do I feel about my mother in this moment? Or what sort of things am I struggling with before I head off to the academy? And when she says this to me, how does that actually make me feel? And those are more powerful and immersive questions than, new person, who dis, what does that mean? I don't know anyway. And that there's the surface layer of these comic book examples, and then there's the deeper layer of, you already know these people. Now, what are the deeper interactions that you can have that has a stronger meaning and a better grounding in the setting that you're playing in?
Yeah, and Adam mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I'm sure we've mentioned this on the podcast, but I think that the best tool to really help both DMs and players play in this style, because this is a stylistic preference, is to have what's called a reference document. And what this is I use a Google Doc. You can use whatever you want, but that tends to be my shared document of choice, where you as the DM put whatever you want your players to be responsible for knowing so that they can immerse themselves in their games, because responsibility and empowerment are intrinsically linked. You can't be empowered if you're not accountable. You put in all your world details there and you share it with your players and you leave it as a living document. So if they discover something about the world, you put it in there. So again, when they're designing their characters, they can be responsible in making sure that they put their characters in the world. Because as much as you as the DM really want them to, if they are not also accepting the responsibility of being a part of this world and making meaning out of it, it's a one-sided street and they're going to have less fun with it, So by having kind of a living document that is detailed that the players can reference back to, now they can role play more confidently because they've done a little bit of practice in advance. And I would say that going through a reference doc should be part of your session 0. My latest campaign world, which is Geras, this was one of the practices I made. And in addition to all of the world details, there's sections on homebrew mechanics, so that if a player forgets kind of a homebrew rule, they can go back and they get an additional option. There's variant lore, variant rules for like some of the races might work a little differently or something. There's also a whole section on progression. So when you level up, you get certain equipment things. So it's all that is detailed. The idea, though, is to have a reliable resource everyone has access to at all times, while also with the understanding that you as the DM are allowed to make changes. Just make sure to communicate those changes. And the other thing that a living document allows you to do is organize your thoughts, because the way to get players to understand is by using an organizational method that makes it easy for them to understand. You know, I've heard horror stories of DMs getting really excited about a homebrew world and creating an 80-page setting Bible, sending it to their players and say, read this and you'll have fun. That now is an obstacle to having fun rather than something that they can freely reference, which is why it's a reference doc, not a setting Bible, you know?
Yeah, that's something that I think WebDM has also talked about, is that you as the DM are not supposed to be a creative writer. You're not writing creative stories. Like this, it sounds counterintuitive, but like you're not writing a book. Like this isn't supposed to be like a high fantasy novel the size of like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, with all sorts of languages made up in it, made from actual etymology, which is, I mean, I think that's fun to do, but it's still you're not trying to read a story to your players. You're not just giving them Outlander and saying, have fun with that. It's like, this isn't a game. This is a book. This is not what I came here for. And that, I don't know, maybe some players like that kind of thing, but it's not really D&D, you know, at that point. It's exposition. It is lore drops in the absolute sense of the word. It is a chunk of text that they have to get through to understand the world. And it becomes like, we talk about combat being a damage slog. This is a lore slog. Like you are reading for a long time without maybe needing to understand the world. That's actually something that I've been talking about lately as well, which is I've been working on Coursera with my friend, and I'm concerned that she is going to write herself into a corner where everything is going to be too much detail about Coursera, that it's like, well, not only do you burn yourself out doing it, but the stuff that you wrote doesn't leave room for more. It doesn't leave room for creativity. That's why I advocate for this idea. And you know, she's aware of this. She's not like she's not like doing this exactly, but I warned her. I was like, be careful, you're messing with powerful forces, traveler. You need the skeleton of your world, and that's honestly all you really need. Like, you just need to know a couple of things about it. What regions are there? Maybe how many regions? Start with 3, I would say. And this is macro world. This isn't like micro stuff. You just need 3 regions, what those regions are known for, and who lives there. And that's all you really need to know to start filling out your world. And of course, you know, you can start going into more detail from there, but really that's how the settings are built. To start, you start from, in my opinion, you start from the top down. I know a lot of people say start with a village, and it's like, okay, you could do that, but like I feel like you could come into a lot of inconsistencies, like continuity errors or something about the world. Like if you make a whole bunch of things about this one village and it's highly detailed, and it's like, sure, you could work from there, but why not start from the top down and work your way through, and then say, okay, how does this village interact with this village, and things like that. So that's what I'm advocating for when building a world, is start with the basics, start with the general outline in terms of macro, and then maybe a few micro things.
So the approach for start with a village is often in response to a DM that needs to get something up and running quickly. And what we also have to get into our heads and get used to is, if you're building a cooperative story together, you don't have to have a reference document at the beginning. And you might start with a village, and then through playing in that village, make some decisions and go, actually, I think it works this way. And then the village evolves and changes a bit, or, hey, can I know this guy? Do I know this blacksmith? Actually, yeah, you do know that blacksmith. And now it's canon. They know the blacksmith. But at the beginning, maybe they didn't. But you're telling a story cooperatively. What we have to be okay with, and what many DMs think that they're supposed to have already preset, is all the relationships and all the things already made. It's already there. It's and if I change something, I'm doing it wrong. Actually, if you change something, you're adapting to your players and you're making a more immersive experience and you're having fun together. If it's if you make that change and it makes the table better, good job. You win at D&D. Well done. That's what we have to do. Like, it's not about following the exact details that you've laid out for yourself, whether it be a module or not. I've opened up a module. I'm doing a D&D club at my school. And so I've got brand new players of like younger middle school age groups. And I said, you know what, we're going to start with a module. This is the name of the module. And by the way, we might go off the rails immediately. I'm going to give you the prepared story. But if you go left when I say we're going right, you know what? We'll work through it. I'm going to use the Lost Mines of Phandelver, and I've already read through it, and I've made some adjustments for this age group, and we'll see. But I have told them up front, if you have a really cool idea for how the world could work, and I agree with it, then in our version, that's the way the world works. So I want to invite you to be creative in your expressions. And if you think of something kind of neat, you think it's cool, and this is why, present it to the group. And as a group, we can say, I think that'd be cool if that were in the world, or I have some problems with that. I'd like it if we didn't have that. And then, cool, we make those changes. And that's okay. Your world can organically create itself. I think of a very little example. Kingdom Hearts, Winnie the Pooh book. Open it up. It's missing a ton of pages. You got to put the pages back, and you got one little segment that's well-defined, and the rest is blank. Maybe that's your D&D world. You got one little segment that's well-defined, and as you move through it together through the art of making a collective story, this is how the world is born. That is a style of play, and that can be highly energizing and highly immersive for people involved. And this other style is also can be highly immersive and highly valuable and highly satisfying for those involved. In my experience now, and I've experienced many different tables of running off the cuff, let's make the world together, and I've experienced many tables of this is the base world, this is the general knowledge of the world, here's your personal knowledge. And both have been highly satisfying and highly immersive, but in different ways. So when we bring all this out, what I wrote down immediately was, why would players be resistant to this sort of knowledge? And it's what you said, Ian. If it's an 80-page document that says, you must understand this in order to play, and as John said, you must understand this in order to have fun in my world, that's not, I don't think that's a good table. Because the players then, there's a requirement, like a very steep requirement for them to just play. When really, how nice would it be if, and when I say general knowledge, for example, Shadowfell, there is a Dominion War. It lasted from this time period to this time period. This is basically what happened. That's all they need to know. in the past, this war happened, so there might be some tension between these nations. They don't have to know the hyper specifics of this king got mad at this queen and this is why this happened and then there was a surf war and it's just, nope, not needed. Unless they ask about it, and that's the discoverable knowledge. Maybe they go to the library and they go, you know what, I want to know some specifics about the Dominion War. But then it's led by player agency and it's not a required reading. What we get into, and what I've seen many DMs get into a habit of, is thinking, one, that they need to have a full working history of all the details of their world before you start playing, and that the players must know it in order to play. But then in practice, that document, that 80-page history, what gets referenced? Maybe 3 pages of it? Maybe, like in the general scheme of the whole campaign, unless the players do some digging. And that's only if they have to do digging. And I'm not going to require them to do that digging in order to play and have fun. That's not okay. There was a point where I was putting out fiction for Gray Owls, and that was to help me ground in the world. But I still had players that thought that that was a requirement. I was like, no, it's not a requirement. It's not a requirement. But it did add value for those that did read it. And I had to be very careful to not present plot elements and like answers to the mystery for only those that read the fiction, because I didn't want the fiction to become a requirement. And that was a really weird tightrope to try to walk, because you can love your world, but you also don't want to put up walls of resistance for your players. So all of that being said is, if you are a DM out there that's like, I just want to start with a village, I don't want to have to worry about making the whole world, don't. Start with a village. Make that village the best village it can possibly be, and the best village it can village, and tie into your characters and your players and what they want and how and what they are reacting to, and try to like build a story together. But then if you make changes, let everybody know that we've made those changes, and collectively you can build that world together. Hey, everybody, up front, we're going to build this world together. And then you've opened the door. You're not a failure as a DM if you make a change and you go, you know what, I'd like it if this guy was a mayor instead of a tailor. Oh no, like we're not trying to be Mercer, and we're not trying to be Brennan Lee Mulligan either. We're not. You don't have to put yourself on that pedestal. We're just playing a game together.
So I think the what Adam's sentiment here is also something I've been grappling, and it's something I know I'm going to continue to grapple with the community about this until I die, which is the idea that there is an authentic way to play D&D. That if you are playing in a specific style, that is going to be the most fulfilling experience because it's going to be the most authentic. And we were even talking about this before we started recording. There are a lot of unquestioned assumptions about how a game should be run that will somehow heighten the experience and make it more fulfilling, right? Because you're doing it authentically, right? So, and I think a lot of times what happens is one of those unquestioned assumptions that Adam was talking about, the DM should know everything, you know? And I think that a lot of DMs would do themselves much more of a service, and in also their players in much more of a service if they acknowledge the role of discovered knowledge within their own play style, right? Because ultimately the DM, no matter if they've mapped out every continent and every sewer system and every city and village and town, they don't know how the players are going to react to the situation. They don't know what characters the players are going to want to play at the table. They may have an idea and they may guide towards certain archetypes that they're expecting, but they don't know, and they don't know how the dice is going to roll, right? So inherent to the game is discovered knowledge, and fighting against that rather than understanding the optimal amount of prep for your given group is going to be more destructive than it's going to be helpful. Now, I know we've kind of been be like, you shouldn't do a setting Bible. You should what's the purpose of a reference document? And to me, the balance is you know you've got it. You know you've got the optimal relationship when your players have enough information that allows them to empower themselves responsibly through understanding what the information of the world is without having to present them so much information that it railroads their decision making. So the idea, I think the merge, because both of you presented both very valid ideas. Adam was start with a village. Ian said start with a top down. You start with the basics in that you create enough of a top down, you establish enough regions, countries, general national politics, that your players are free to take responsibility for creating characters that are grounded in the world. Even if those nations are something you come up with that character, right? and you also you detail functionally as the DM, you detail functionally what the players are going to interact with. So if the players are gonna start their adventure in a village, start with the village, right? Detail the village, but that doesn't mean you ignore everything else, right? But also, you may not be the one to prep that. You may discover what the other nations of your world are based on how you set up your players ahead of time. And to get back to tools, this is actually part of my reference document, but I'm going to list this just for anybody who might be listening. After I actually basically have 2 session zeros, and this has been my most successful prep for when it comes to what kind of adventures I want my players to have and all that. I set up a group session 0 where we kind of go through, all right, there are 9 major nations of the world. This is kind of what this is, a military nation. This is the academy nation. This is what they're kind of known for. This is why they're mad at each other, right? After that, my players start to think about what character might be interesting to play and where they might have been from, which might be with that nation or against it. It might be, I have a proud family lineage from the military nation, so I was a soldier. Or, I didn't like that my dad wanted me to be a soldier, so I became a bard and left home, But somehow their behavior is informed by wherever they decided to come from, So what I then do is I have one-on-one conversations with each of my players. And these ran the gamut from a 10-minute chat to a 2-hour debate, because every player is going to want to spend a different amount of time, and you just leave room for that. So the 10 questions that I ask my players when they're coming up with their characters is, where was your character born and who is their family? Are any of their family members still alive? That way we can create NPCs together. And my player's like, yeah, my mom's name was this, my dad's name was this, my dad's name was Moral, I'm Garon, son of Moral. So now you've got something to go off of as a DM. What social and economic class did your character grow up in? Were they impoverished? Were they nobles? Were they middle class? That may inform their behavior. It may not, or it may inform some of the connections they may have. If they're middle class from a merchant's guild, that's going to be a different connection than the princess nobility that I knew about. How did your character come upon their current character class, and how are they trained? Were they self-taught? Did they have a mentor? Another NPC to use? Notice that these are all also world building questions, because as the DM, you're discovering what kind of character your players want to play, so that you can provide an appropriate experience that will feel authentic to them, right? Because D&D isn't authentic. It's an authentic, unique experience based on the table that you're at. Who helped or hindered them along the way? More NPC questions. What's your character's views on politics and religion, if they have any? So ambivalence is a perfectly fine answer, but it may be like Solomon respected paladins but was less inclined to respect clerics, because at least paladins follow through on their oaths. That's a very specific view on the religion in the world. What are your character's current goals? Even if it's just get paid, that's a goal, or, sleep indoors tonight, that's a goal. So when my players are like, my character has no goals, it's like, well, they at least want to continue living. That is why we are playing them. So what does your character regret, right? Now you may be able to build in a conflict in the world, right? It's like maybe your player fought in a war, or maybe your player betrayed a thieves guild, you know. Now again, kind of like what Adam is saying, your characters are informing your world building. And it might be you've thought of a thieves guild you hadn't presented to the rest of your players. Now you can slide that in as personal knowledge, but your players are creating their character's own personal knowledge in tandem with the general knowledge of the reference doc. This one I stole from Zipper on Disney on YouTube. What lie does your character tell themselves to make things easier? Some of it is, you know, the big lie is that I at the beginning of this pandemic, I started identifying myself as part of this authentic D&D experience, which is if I'm exhausted, my session went well. And that's a lie that honestly, if you're exhausted and just because you played for a longer time doesn't mean that you had that much more fun. You know, sometimes your players drag their feet. How does your character see their story ending? Do they think that they're going to die heroically? Do they see themselves retiring in a mansion? How do they see it ending? And then how is your character acquainted with the party, or at least how if they were to join the party on this mission, what would be their motivation to do it? And that might be tied to their goal. It might not be. But at least now you're not going to get those weird loner, edgy characters that's like, well, my character wouldn't do this mission. It's like, all right, then don't play. Like, if you're going to do that, like, if you're going to play the game we're sitting down to play, you know? But that way, if you have that conversation ahead of time, now you're not going to be stuck in the middle of a session trying to figure out everybody else's thing of fun, like definition of fun. There will be players that will go left when you want to go right, simply to irritate you because they think it's funny. You know, they're antagonistic players. And to me, I'm not interested in playing with people like that. So this kind of weeds them out right away, you know?
Now, when we talk about a reference document, I find that my sessions are stronger and I get faster at building them. But I can completely see the other side where someone is fearful of having to even ask those questions of the players. But then I go back to the idea of starting with a village and opening the door to being organic in your world building together, like in your cooperative world building. You can use your session 0 as that first session in the village. And this is, I think, where that term 0.5 comes from that I started coining, that it isn't, you are playing the game, you are experiencing the game in real time, but you're also making retcons, you're making adjustments to how you interact with the world. You're asking those questions that sometimes when a player is building their character for the very first time, they may not know how to even approach those questions. And I'm not saying it takes a lot to do that, to approach those questions, but sometimes people are so resistant to the idea of that, they just want to start playing, or they already are trying to compress the knowledge of just building the character. They just want to go and see what happens. And then through the experience of play, we'll start to be able to answer those questions. So I wonder if a nuanced way of blending this is to take a few of those very helpful questions and present them during that session as we're playing the game and understanding the mechanics and just messing around. And what we do is we say this, hey, everybody, this session isn't necessarily canon. We're going to play around with this and use it as like our way to both understand how the game works, to maybe I'll put you into a combat. You can experience how combat might flow. And that also shows you how the numbers work in play. And if you decide, you know what, I don't want to be a fighter, I'd like to be a monk, then we can rebuild that and we change that in that session, because we get like a practice session. And in that practice session, maybe we also get some of our questions answered, because the players might be so tunnel visioned in just, I made a character, I'm a dwarf and I go swing my club and I like swinging my hammer, that they're so focused on that we may not have even approached the thought of who are my parents, and maybe that's something we get to experience while we're playing the game. And that, I have been at tables, have been so energizing sometimes when we get to play and then go, by the way, your parents show up. What are their names? And the player has to go, George and Sally. And it's hilarious and fun. And now it's canon. My parents' names are George and Sally. Do you have a good relationship with them, or is it kind of rough? Well, they always wanted me to become a chicken farmer, and I want to be an adventurer. So this is how I think I interact with them. And then it's not also me, the DM, dictating this is the relationship you have with your parents. It can maybe be an organic thing. Now, that works at some tables, and maybe it doesn't work at others, and I can see both ends of that. But I think for the players that I've worked with that really want to hit the ground running, I can see the resistance to having to answer some of those questions before they roll the dice. But when I'm teaching learning games, especially like really like complete base zero, level zero knowledge, sometimes for the younger ones, we hit the ground running so that they can experience the game mechanics, and then we'll ask those questions and build that world together, and then kind of like at the end review, okay, this is what we figured out. This is what we like to establish. What could we change about the world? What do you think worked well? What do you think was sort of confusing? Do you have other questions about combat? And that way we can sort of all reflect on that experience together and then say, okay, do you want that to be our first session? Or are there any other things you'd like to change? And then together we can tell that story. Looks like John's about to explode.
Let me rewind to the very beginning of this podcast episode. So, inferential world building, which is the topic that we've been diving into this whole episode, really is a technique, mindset, whatever you want to call it, to developing immersion as a priority in your game experience. To look back on all the tools that we've mentioned and all the advice that we've given, immersion is a advanced skill set that is not appropriate for every table and is very permission based for your players. If your players are not comfortable being vulnerable in a highly immersive setting, it is probably not going to end the way you want it to. So all the tools we've mentioned as part of inferential world building, reference docs, the 10 character questions I just said, even a session 0 or a session 0.5, all of those are tool sets that allow a DM and a table to immerse themselves in an imaginary space, again, which inherently also leads to emotional vulnerability. There are a lot of players that will violently react against that. So if I have new players, immersion is not a priority. Understanding the mechanics of the game is. Not even storytelling, because I don't want them to wrap themselves up with, again, getting stuck with their expectations of what an authentic D&D experience is. Because, again, what's authentic is going to be different for each table. So if it's new players, especially younger new players, setting boundaries and rules is thing number one. Get them to be nice to each other, teach them what an attack roll is and how that's different than a damage roll. I would even say teenagers is like the minimum age group. I wouldn't do this with anyone younger than a teenager. And they've expressed interest in immersive storytelling. Now you basically, it's like the White Lotus, stand at the garden gates. It's like, all right, we can dive into the Matrix. You got to know these things up front. There's going to be emotional vulnerability. You're going to have to play nicely and be respectful to everybody else. This is going to be heavily empathic. If we hit those things right, it's going to be satisfying and fulfilling. And we're going to trust each other as humans more on the other side. But there's going to be rough patches, and there's going to be times where you experience very intense, real emotions that even metacognitively, you may try to justify why you're allowed or not allowed to feel these things, Ultimately, that's a higher level of gameplay, but it's not for everyone. I've met players that have been playing for 10, 15 years that still are not mature enough as gamers or as people to really be entrusted with that kind of experience, you know? And especially when it comes to the tool sets we've mentioned, again, this is all permission based. When I started Geras, which is kind of like my standard for how these immersive tools can be applied elegantly, it started with, this is the game I'm comfortable running as a DM. You are players I have played with for years that I am comfortable being vulnerable with my world too. I am trusting you to not violate the experience that we are agreeing on together. If you would like to participate, you are welcome to attend our session 0. If this is too intense for you, because this is going to be intense prep, you're welcome to bow out, right? And that doesn't mean I won't play with you. It just means that this particular experience isn't going to be a good fit, you know? So every single player opted to play. Nobody bowed out, because ultimately they now had control and they were empowered to make the responsible decision. And the responsible decision being, I'm going to take this somewhat seriously and actually put this prep work into my character. Children under the age of, I would say, 12, developmentally don't understand the impact of that kind of responsibility. They just don't have the life experience or the biology to keep up with it, you know? So ultimately, it's not an experience I would offer them. But this is even for the game, I think I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned on the podcast, I'm playing a game with my grandma right now because she's like super into this. I didn't do any of these techniques because teaching her the mechanics of the game is more important than doing a deep dive, emotionally vulnerable, immersive game, you know?
That really just gets me going. Like I at this stage in my life, I can really agree with that, because I am looking for those emotional stories to tell. And like, those are the books that I also enjoy the most, is the ones that explore complex concepts and character issues, scenarios where I know who this character is, but they're put into a place. It's not fish out of water per se. Like, it's not just like, oh, they lived here and now they're like in a world they don't know anything about. It's they're navigating these complex social scenarios that reflect on, you know, my life. And like, even if I haven't seen those scenarios, I can live vicariously through them, because that is how I am gathering, I guess you could say, I'm accruing wisdom about how to navigate those scenarios by watching my characters as I play them go through them themselves, or reading about them in the case of books, or watching them in anime. um, it's just like with Rowan, I am so emotionally invested. Like, I loved playing Eld. Eld was my Sorlock character, very chaotic-y, I would say. He still had some emotion, but he dealt with the Fae, so it was very chaotic in that sense. And it was also Night Owls, so it wasn't as like there like towards the end, for sure, there was a lot of deep roleplay and stuff, and that's why I'm excited for Dark Owls now, because that's where we're looking towards more. But you know, at the start, it was more like Sorlock, you know, do Sorlock things, bam bam with the Eldritch Blast, and it's a good time, and I enjoy that. But just like how I don't want to have a session where there is no combat, so to speak, as a player. Like, I love the social encounters, but I need that combat to break the tension. I enjoy playing characters that are diverse and have diverse interests in that sense. With Rowan, I sympathize with her so much. And when I was writing her backstory, because I love creative writing, and I was like, what? And of course it's tragic. What can I do to set up a scenario that I haven't felt myself before for her? and how can I sympathize with that? And literally, I was doing this in the car ride, and I was doing it on my phone. That's just how much I love writing. Is like I will write short fiction on my phone, but I could feel the guilt. I could feel the sorrow. Like she turns to drinking at some point to try and dampen that pain that she feels at losing her family. This isn't really a secret, so so I'm not like spoiling anything. And eventually she bounces back, but it's not like she's accepting what happened to them. She's looking to change things, and I feel that. I feel that desire for change in a scenario that I am powerless in. I'm actually getting a little teary-eyed at how much. Oh, excuse me, geez.
That cut the tension.
We'll cut that part out. But I'm actually getting a little teary-eyed at just how much I sympathize with her scenario, because she's got PTSD, and it's worse because it's magical PTSD, and it's like I don't have PTSD as a person, as a player, but exploring that helps me understand the world better and helps me understand other people better. And that's what I love with our motto is I'm becoming a better person by exploring it.
And that what you just said is so profound, because ultimately when people look at the personal growth and development benefits of Dungeons and Dragons, and I mean, one of the things that I say is D&D is not therapy. Therapy is therapy, but there are therapists that use D&D as part of their trained therapy, is that it's an inherent exercise of empathy, which is why part of our REST motto, respect, empathy, satisfaction, trust, that empathy thing is also an advanced thing. 9-year-old isn't going to have that level of empathy. They don't have enough experience to reference for it, but especially for for teens, young adults, older adults that have had those kind of very real painful experiences, exploring that even through somebody else's lenses, it humanizes everybody. And that's why, to speak to Brennan Lee Mulligan, who Adam mentioned earlier for Dimension 20. I think I mentioned that I was listening to his podcast, Adventuring Academy. He had an episode, I think it was episode 4, where he was talking with somebody, and that level of empathy is something that not every human is comfortable with, and it's why these techniques are highly advanced, not only from like how you run your game, but socio-emotionally, like it's just, and it's super powerful. I mean, to be vulnerable too. I was listening to like an anime opening, and I was just imagining what it would look like to have our Grey Owls characters like interact with that level of teamwork. I was so awestruck by the possibility. I actually had to like pull over, and I had to message the chat about, this is why this character is so powerful and why this game is so meaningful, is because to me it's the truest expression of like platonic love, where like it's that teamwork, it's the bonds that we choose to forge, that create that power, and it really resonated with me just in the moment of just, this game allows you to understand and accept and forgive somebody else's true self when it's stripped away of all of the expectations of, society and what people's expectations are. Like, you can play an evil character and nobody's going to judge you as a person for that, but also it was interesting. Like, I just got to this place in Grave Peril from the Dresden Files, where Dresden opens up his ethereal site and sees Murphy's truest form, and to me, one of the things I discovered through Grey Owls is my truest form is lawful good. Like, even in my fantasy, I want to be a good person, and I'm playing an evil character now, and I am super uncomfortable being an evil person. but it lets me be empathetic to people who are evil, you know? And that's why a lot of times I find that it's unhelpful to be judgmental without being empathetic to people that you neither agree or like. You know, they're especially in our real world right now, and this is getting very real now that I'm thinking about it. There's a lot of very real trauma we're going through as a society, and it's more divisive and polarized than it's ever been. And really, I think empathy is the cure and treatment. You know, that not once you say be better, you're the enemy, you know, you're just wrong, I don't have to justify myself to you. And that happens on every side of every debate I've ever seen. The methods are exactly the same, even if the moral positions are different. I think D&D helps us be our best selves because it allows us to look through the eyes of somebody else that we neither like nor agree with, and it allows us to empathize with them. That's how you build a bridge of understanding between them, you know? So, and I think that's the true beauty of it. And it's something we've talked about, but it's particularly relevant given the grave circumstances that our world is in right now.
There have been countless instances where I have had interactions, often as an NPC to a character, that have been wholly transformative, and I've been expressed after the fact. That were clearly impactful on some deep emotional way or deeply empathetic for that player, not just the character, the player. Like they worked through something. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a dungeon master. But my players are people that I deeply trust and who trust me. And I think back to what my one of my blog posts called Boundaries, and how my fantasy realm of Io, or the Ionian landscape, just there are certain ugly things in our world today that I will not ever have in that fantasy world. That you could be gay, straight, bi, I don't care. And it's not that I don't care like I don't care about you, as in the world itself has... There's no prejudice.
Prejudices. Yeah,
yes,
okay,
there's
you got to it.
There are no prejudices. There's no sexism. There's a lot of diarchies. In fact, in a lot of places, it's a matriarchy. But it's not like a matriarchy like the men are bad. It's just that it happens to be ruled by a woman or a council of women. And still, it isn't that they're evil to the men. It's not a versus thing. It's they were the most appropriate for the job. And that's all it has to be. Then you're valued, everyone's valued differently. And unfortunately, there's also in the lore of Dungeons and Dragons, like when you talk about Lolth, there is sexism. And it's like the males are disposable, but also that can be a theological thing that is present without it being normal. In IO, that's not normal, which is where then the players and the characters can go, that's not normal. And the normal is that we're equal. And the normal is that we are tied into our skill sets and what we're good at. And but there's no rape in IO. There's none of those crazy prejudices. There might be societal things where, like, if they're in the history, like we've established in the world, maybe half-orcs might be viewed differently because a little while ago there was an orcish insurgence, and so half-orcs might be difficult. Or if there is racism, there's a societal historical reason for it, and maybe it's not normal. So that maybe the players and the characters can also sort of rally against it. But in a lot of ways, what this really ties into and what this making me think of is recently having a conversation as NPC to character that I was informed later was a conversation that person had never had in real life. And it was communicating that, the people that aren't going to stand by you, maybe they're not worth it. Maybe you don't need them in your life if they're related to you or not. Maybe your found family is the more powerful thing because they value you for yourself and they're going to be there for who you really are. And this is coming from an acting perspective. That's how that character, based on their interactions and their life would have found a connection with that other player character. But then it also offers a safe space where things like that can be expressed. It doesn't have to be therapy. And at that moment, I myself am not putting myself ahead to where the player is like, I'm going to help you with your life. It's just, this is how this person would value this other character, and this is how they would communicate genuinely in this way. Then to understand later that spoke to that player in such a deep way also shows a moment of immersion that is valuable in ways we can we discussed before. This game can have profound effects on its players. It can also just be a game, and that can change day to day, table to table. But sometimes we're not always prepared for how things are going to affect us in the moment. And to understand from another player in Grey Owls that they worked through some very tremendous things in their life over the course of playing that game, and that game changed them for the better. And it's not just that game, but playing with the people at that table and running through that story and being open to that level of immersion and exploring those thoughts and ideas and being vulnerable to them. By creating a space that has appropriate boundaries, we can make something safe where players can feel vulnerable and explore those things. And for some of our players, they maybe don't have those opportunities in the other aspects of their life. We don't necessarily need that knowledge to make a good table for them, but it doesn't detract from the value that they might have.
Yeah, so you just brought up a lot of good points I want to unpack a little bit. One being that in your world building, you can decide there are certain ugly things that you choose to eliminate. Like they're just either super sensitive topics where this is not an appropriate place to explore them, and a lot of times the topics you do choose to explore, the magic of D&D is that you can overcome them pretty definitively. So like one of the things being that, there are some players that are uncomfortable with slavery in a game world, and that was something we actually explored in Cloudsinger, the outcome being we defeated the system. We burned the city to the ground so that to free the oppressed people and empower them to better society, and give them a voice. So a lot of times the ugly things that you do choose to add are tackled in a positive light, and they aren't, like you said, like to bring Lulth as an example, it is universally understood that theology is abhorrent, that is not something we're saying this is how society should be run. It's seen as this is an evil society perpetuated by an extraplanar being that is playing the strings and making these people that she's seduced into worshiping her do these evil acts to each other. And also, what then can you do to help out, is the other side of it. Like one of the criticisms of Faerun is that, well, now the Drow are just evil, we should kill them on sight because they're evil. You can't have a good one, And now that starts to have its own harmful side of everything kind of going on. To kind of speak to the therapy thing, I've got two sayings that I think really, I say them over and over again, but they really encapsulate my personal view, because again, this game can be profound, but it doesn't have to be, you know. To me, D&D can be therapeutic. It's not therapy. There have been times we've all played games that feel emotionally cathartic, or like you said, Adam, you know, sometimes, especially you've never had this kind of conversation that leads to some kind of insight or enlightenment in your personal life, right? We're being our best selves through gaming. That's what we're doing, right? But it's not therapy. This is therapeutic, but it's not therapy. And in the same way, it's not a bad thing to play a troubled character. Just be mindful about bringing your troubles to the table. Your group is not responsible for your like emotional things that you're going through. They can help, they can be supportive, you know, they can offer an environment again that can feel therapeutic. It is not a substitute for therapy, and it is not a substitute for, you know, dealing with your own troubles, you know. So it can get to the point that, and that's part of the trust, the T in rest, is that you can start to withdraw the trust you've invested in by leaning too hard on trying to make it okay for you to act in a certain way that's inappropriate at the table too, you know. And that's why it's good to have a session 0 where we're laying down the expectations. What kind of world are we exploring? What topics are off limits, you know? And yeah, you might want to work through some stuff, but it's not everybody else's responsibility at the table to work out that stuff for you, you know? So, and there might be some tables where you discuss some certain ideas, you know, everyone is comfortable discussing certain ideas than other players are, but you want to have those constant check-ins. And you know what? You can feel when it gets weird, you know, at least the DM or at least one player, even if they're not comfortable speaking up about it, you can feel when there's a shift or when things get uncomfortable or when things get weird. And that's going to defeat the purpose of it feeling therapeutic if other players are going to be uncomfortable to contribute to playing in that environment, you know? So it's a fine edge to navigate, but just know this game can have those that's part of being emotionally vulnerable. When you thin the membrane, you allow more stuff in, which could also mean additional toxins or something a little more harmful, you know?
I wonder if there's a discoverable knowledge for us as people. And when I bring up these examples, it's strange because you're absolutely right. There's a fine line of difference. Where there are instances if someone brings trauma to the table and then tries to work through it in like big ways through the game, that's like something that's in the moment. There's almost like an intention behind it, or there's other layers in play, and that's when we say, oh, this is getting a little weird, let's take a break, and maybe I'll have a chat with that player. Or I've had players that have been going through some tough stuff, and they'll come to the game and go, I think we're okay, and then in the middle of the game go, you know what, I'm getting really like frustrated, and it's not you, and it's not the game. I have to leave right now and just deal with this. And that's them being very aware humans to say, I'm getting into that. They're not going to try and use the game as the release for this exact moment. Maybe this is something they have to go and pay attention to. And then but the instances that I think have been the most rewarding of what I'm referencing have been something sort of discovered after the fact, where we'll role play this scenario, and then afterwards, after the game has ended, the session has ended, that player will reflect on them and go, man, that's why that hit me so hard. Or we'll talk about it with the rest of the group and say, hey, everybody, I'm sorry, I shed some tears there because I think this is why that was very impactful to me. And there's a very humanness and empathetic value to opening up in that way and being introspective and reflective on those things. But there are toxic ways that can manifest at the table. And it's being aware that if you start to feel that toxicity, that taking a break is absolutely a good idea. Uh, totally do that. Um, and yeah, the D&D can be therapeutic. It is not therapy, and you should not come to the table, I think, seeking therapy. And that's kind of that intention. Unfortunately, I have read posts on Facebook groups of players coming to the table like, I'm going to work through my trauma at the table. And it's like, oh boy, there's a different intention there. Whereas if you come into the table, I'm going to explore this character, it might get a little difficult, and I'm going to see how this goes. And you're at a good table that you're communicative to each other about your levels of comfort, and you can trust one another to be vulnerable and say something if something is weird. Those are two different things. And unfortunately, you can have people show up at the table that are like, this is what I'm going to use this character to work through my trauma and bring some uncomfortable things to the table. This is also what had initially prompted me writing that blog post on boundaries, where I had players that were writing backstories that were heavily involved in going to very dark, difficult places that I decided was just too uncomfortable for both me as the DM to run those possible instances and to bring those things to the table for players that maybe haven't bought into that kind of trauma. Just for them to be able to say, these things do not exist in my world. We're not even going to go there. And that will provide a better safe space. We can still tell dark stories. There's plenty of dark stuff that we can tell, but we're not going there because, in my honest opinion, that shouldn't exist in the world. So I'm not putting it in my fantasy world. Yeah. So you can decide where the lines are. And then also, if you have that line that you never cross, what other new stories can come from that and other new explorations.
Yeah, well, and to clarify Adam's point too, like, we're not saying slavery should be a thing. We're just saying that, like, there are certain institutions and certain things where, and you know it table by table, but some players have such intimate boundaries that we just don't even talk about it, because this isn't the place to talk about it. Whereas something that might have been involved in an ugly history, something that it's still very real and still very painful, but it's a little more removed from like the thing we're experiencing now. That can be, a lot of times you can set up your world as like, this is something wrong that your players can intervene. I was thinking interject, but intervene with, and do the right thing. And I think that, we've talked about a few ways that the game can be powerful and profound. Ultimately, I think if you're wondering, right, am I crossing a line? Am I accidentally bringing my troubles to the table? One of the ways that you can kind of distinguish it, like a tool you can use, where are you coming from for your character's journey? Is your character learning to be okay with a bad thing that happened, or are they seeking some kind of empowerment? Like you're creating a positive thing as opposed to relinquishing a negative thing, And I think a lot of times that can be a good way to empower yourself as well, and it's just two different ways to kind of look through it. So, you have one player that's like, I'm a little shy as a person. It's not, I'm trying to be okay with being shy. It's maybe I'll role play someone that's a little more little more willing to speak up. So I'm adding a positive trait to myself instead of trying to dive into a negative one, and I think when you frame it that way, suddenly the game can be just as therapeutic and it can be just as empowering. Whereas like what you were saying with the NPC conversation, Adam, what it sounded like was a player was like, I now opened up a possibility, as opposed to, I didn't realize this dark thing that poked at a wound that I still haven't recovered from, So, and that's why, if you look at Solomon's backstory, I'm bragging about this character again, but technically he has the tragic orphan stereotypical backstory. His parents were killed in a monster attack, his maid family was all slaughtered by a betrayer from the inside. When you talk to him in character, none of that ever came up. That was something I created as a reason for why he behaves the way he does sometimes, but that wasn't something that other players are necessarily meant to discover unless they're like, hey, where were you at age 6? Then he might answer honestly, but when you looked at the things that he was trying to add to the group, add knowledge, add perception, add a logical inference, and yeah, he was a little rough around the edges and he wasn't the nicest one and he'd be brutally honest, but it wasn't about who he was. It was about learning where he's going to go, and ultimately Solomon's story arc was one about trust. And honestly, until we split the groups, he didn't have a team he could trust. And that became part of his arc. Trusting Melisande, the NPC, that's now his wife, trusting Molotov, a solid character that proved his reliability over time, trusting Aurora, someone who was a little naive to some of the other things in the world, but had great power and great potential, trusting Rowan, because Rowan was open enough to be able to trust him. How could he not do the same, So that it's interesting. Are you trying to add a positive element or a positive skill set to yourself, or are you trying to come to terms with a wound that you had suffered personally, And I think that when you start looking towards the positive direction with the game, you'll find answers personally for the treatment without having to bring that wound to the table. Do you know what I mean? That's my theory. Largely unproven because I came up with it just now. But so if you definitely have other counter examples or something else to show me why disagreement, I think healthy disagreement is how we better ourselves. That's the growing pains. And I think to come back to, we're in a weird, ugly world right now, is that if we saddle up with those of us who are too like-minded and are unwilling to disagree with, we're going to become trapped in our own separate camps, and we're going to destroy ourselves and corrode ourselves from the inside out. But again, largely unproven. We'll see where it goes. It's only 2021. What could 2040 have to offer?
Now, oddly enough, I actually think there's a connection to everything we've discussed so far. We've gone some deep ways, some deep places in this whole discussion. But when we started to address inferential world building and then started to tie us into knowledge and discoverable knowledge, we've addressed the comfort at the table and the comfort for certain techniques for building characters and creating your worlds, what's most appropriate for different tables of different ages, as well as comfort levels, establishing boundaries at your table so that the experience is immersive and dynamic while being respectful. In all of that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the thing I've always found most valuable in the game world and in life is the discovered knowledge. The things you might discover about the world at large, the things that connects the pieces, that bind them to you, like discovered knowledge that is connected to you, not just this random Jeopardy fact. The things that I'm able to find and then become actionable, like actionable information that may improve my own life or improve my relationships with others or improve my own agency. This works in the game world and also works in life. What we are also getting into is the things we discover about ourselves as we play the game and as we run the game. Even before this discussion came about, the gentleman and I were having a wonderful discussion where I discovered that I have some fears about how to run certain styles of games, because I think that I'll lose momentum or I'll lose my human connections with others because I'm trying a different style. And so that makes me uncomfortable. But that also lends credence and value to trying those things, to actually experience them and then discover what the truth is about that. And we can become better people through that, to recognize that just because we're used to something doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only way. That even the discomfort of change might be worth exploring, because then you have other experiences. You have discovered something else. You can choose to do something with that or not, but you have then the discovered knowledge. You can discover through the conversations with NPCs that, wow, maybe no one's ever told me that I'm actually worth it. And oh my God, did that not happen in the other parts of my life? That's a discovered knowledge. And even if that's a deep thing, that's okay. There's something very healthy about that discovery. And I hope that all of your tables provide the safety and respect and empathy and the immersion and the trust to create those possible experiences. Not manufactured, not scripted. These are organic things that come out of playing at tables that are, kind and respectful. The good tables that you trust each other and you're playing with friends. And then at those tables, maybe give them a living document and try out some deep questions and try to create more inferential world building to see if that raises the bar of your play. Maybe it's not for that table, but you won't know unless you try it out. Even if you have fears about it, maybe try it out. Then you'll have discovered more knowledge and you can decide to be actionable on it. Or maybe that wasn't for us. Let's go back to beer and pretzels D&D and we'll just make our town. And that's all awesome. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. If you want to help support the show or gain access to early episodes, you can go over to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. We also offer some DM coaching in that. It's awesome. You can find us over at our website, which is DM Shower Thoughts. It's also a link in the description down below. We have our Facebook page as well. And by linking to all those things, you'll find all of our other connections as well. We got a Twitch account, we've got a YouTube account, but all those things is a good, easy funnel to find everything. Have a wonderful day, everyone. And please, game responsibly. Bye-bye.
I strive to defend New Talos and live up to my role as a spiritual leader.
I journey to increase my knowledge of the cusp and cosmos. It has been prophesied that there is destiny in my blood.
I fight for the honor of the name Steadyhand and the great kingdom of Earth.
I wander to find my true place in the world. I will protect my home and family at all costs.
A young ruler's grasp for power threatens an already fractured world. Meet the heroes in Arc 2 of Advantage, a 5th edition D&D audio drama. Find us on all podcast apps.